The oldest bow at the tournament was about to expose the youngest mistake in the crowd. The annual Cedar Ridge Archery Festival had always attracted some of the finest recreational and competitive archers across the state, but this year's event promised something no one could ignore. A bright red banner stretched across the entrance read, $10,000 to whoever hits every target. Pickup trucks, sport utility vehicles, and trailers filled the gravel parking lot as hundreds of spectators wandered between food stands, sponsor tents, and practice lanes beneath the warm July sun. New carbon bows gleamed beneath the daylight, polished sights reflected flashes of silver, and conversations drifted through the breeze about draw weights, stabilizers, and expensive accessories that cost more than some used cars. Everyone believed the winner would be carrying the newest equipment money could buy. Then an old blue pickup rolled slowly into the last open parking space. The engine shut off quietly, and an elderly man stepped onto the gravel with steady movements that showed neither urgency nor hesitation. Walter Mercer was 79 years old. His faded denim shirt had been washed so many times that the color had softened into pale blue, and the sleeves were rolled neatly above weathered forearms marked by decades of outdoor work. His boots were worn but carefully maintained, and his calm gray eyes moved across the festival grounds without the slightest sign of intimidation. He reached into the truck bed and lifted a long canvas case whose leather straps had darkened with age. Several nearby competitors glanced toward him before returning to their conversations. One young archer nudged his friend and quietly laughed. "That thing belongs in a museum." More smiles followed. Walter ignored every one of them. He carried the case with quiet care toward the registration table where Ryan Foster greeted competitors with practiced confidence. At 20 years old, Ryan had become one of the youngest event coordinators in the region. He knew nearly every modern bow on the market, recognized professional brands at a glance, and prided himself on keeping the competition running smoothly. As Walter carefully unfastened the old canvas case, Ryan leaned forward with polite curiosity that quickly turned into disbelief. Resting inside was a beautifully crafted longbow made from ashwood. Years of careful use had polished the grip until it shone softly beneath the sunlight. There were no sights, no stabilizers, no modern attachments, only smooth wood, simple craftsmanship, and a small bundle of cedar arrows resting beside it. Ryan blinked once before forcing a friendly smile. "Sir, are you planning to compete with that bow?" Walter looked up with an easy expression. "That is why I brought it." Ryan hesitated, searching for words that sounded respectful. "The course today is much more demanding than most local competitions. The targets reach out to 100 yards, and several are intentionally smaller than regulation size. Most competitors are using advanced equipment because of the difficulty." Walter nodded gently as though he had simply been given the weather forecast. "I understand." Ryan glanced toward the display tent where sponsors offered demonstration bows to participants. "You are welcome to borrow one of the newer models if you would like. There is no charge." A few competitors standing nearby listened openly now, waiting for the old man to accept the obvious advice. Walter rested one hand lightly on the smooth ashwood before answering. "I have trusted this bow for many years. I do not think today is the right day to change friends." Quiet laughter spread through the small crowd. One spectator shook his head while another whispered that $10,000 would disappear before the old man reached his second target. Ryan handed Walter his registration badge, still wearing a courteous smile, but deep inside he had already crossed the elderly veteran's name off the list of serious contenders. Walter simply thanked him, pinned the badge onto his faded shirt, and walked toward the practice field with the old ash bow resting comfortably across his shoulder, while the laughter behind him slowly blended into the warm summer wind. Walter Mercer walked past the practice lanes without stopping, ignoring the rhythmic sound of carbon arrows striking foam targets all around him. Most competitors had already begun making final adjustments to expensive sights, stabilizers, and release aids while coaches stood nearby offering last-minute advice. Walter carried none of those things. The old ash bow rested comfortably in his hand as though it had become an extension of his arm long before anyone at Cedar Ridge had ever heard his name. He quietly selected an empty practice lane near the edge of the field where fewer people were paying attention. Instead of immediately reaching for an arrow, he stood perfectly still and looked across the rolling landscape beyond the targets. The breeze drifted gently from left to right, causing the small American flags along the boundary fence to flutter in slow, uneven waves. Leaves high in the oak trees moved with a different rhythm than the grass below them, revealing subtle changes in the wind that most competitors never noticed. Walter watched every detail without saying a word. A few lanes away, Ryan Foster continued greeting late arrivals before glancing toward the elderly veteran. Curious despite himself, he walked across the gravel until he reached the practice area. "Mr. Mercer," he called politely. Walter turned with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. Ryan nodded toward the old bow. "There is still time to switch if you change your mind. The sponsor tent has several modern competition bows already adjusted for different draw lengths. They are remarkably accurate." Walter smiled gently before looking back toward the distant targets. "Accuracy has never belonged to the bow." Ryan gave a polite laugh, assuming the answer was little more than an old saying. "Perhaps not, but technology certainly helps." Walter simply nodded. "Sometimes it does." There was no argument, no attempt to prove anyone wrong. That quiet confidence puzzled Ryan far more than a defensive response would have. He expected pride or stubbornness. Instead, he found patience. As Ryan walked away, two younger competitors approached the neighboring lane carrying sleek compound bows fitted with large scopes and precision stabilizers. One of them glanced toward Walter's equipment and whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "My grandfather had something like that hanging over his fireplace." His friend chuckled. "Maybe he thinks this is a historical demonstration instead of a competition." Their laughter blended with the steady sound of arrows striking targets. Walter continued preparing as though the conversation had happened somewhere far away. He carefully removed one cedar arrow from the leather quiver and slowly ran his fingertips along the feather fletching, checking each vein with practiced attention. He examined the wooden shaft, confirmed that the arrow rested perfectly straight, then returned it to the quiver without firing. Nearby competitors exchanged confused looks. Some assumed the elderly veteran was nervous. Others believed he had forgotten how to shoot. None of them noticed that Walter was studying the changing wind rather than the targets themselves. Near the equipment shed, an older maintenance worker named Harold Bennett paused while replacing a boundary marker. At 72 years old, Harold had spent decades maintaining archery ranges across the region. His eyes settled on Walter's posture for only a brief moment before he stopped working entirely. There was something unexpectedly familiar about the veteran's relaxed stance, the precise position of his feet, and the effortless way he held the old ash bow without unnecessary movement. Harold frowned thoughtfully, searching memories that seemed buried somewhere far beyond the noise of the festival. He could not explain why, but the sight stirred something he had not thought about in many years. A loudspeaker interrupted the morning conversations as the event announcer called every competitor to the main shooting field. Practice time had ended. Hundreds of spectators gathered behind the safety barriers while cameras from a local television station prepared to record the opening round. Ryan took his place near the center of the firing line and began explaining the rules one final time. Walter quietly stepped into his assigned lane, rested the lower tip of the ash bow against the grass, and looked once more toward the distant flags, moving gently beneath the bright July sky. While everyone else focused on the targets ahead, he seemed to be listening to something invisible that only years of patience could teach. The first round began with the sharp sound of the starting horn rolling across the valley, followed by the steady rhythm of bowstrings releasing in nearly perfect succession. Dozens of arrows crossed the warm summer air toward brightly painted targets stretching across the open field. Electronic scoreboards immediately flashed the first wave of results while spectators applauded every clean center hit from the early competitors. Ryan Foster walked behind the firing line with a clipboard in hand, checking scores and watching the participants with the confidence of someone who had organized the event many times before. Most of the experienced archers performed exactly as expected. Their modern equipment delivered impressive consistency, and conversations behind the safety barrier centered on draw weights, sight adjustments, and expensive accessories. Then Ryan noticed something unusual at lane 12. Walter Mercer had not released a single arrow. The elderly veteran remained completely still with the ash bow resting comfortably in his left hand. His calm gray eyes moved beyond the targets toward the distant tree line where the tops of several tall pines shifted gently in the changing breeze. The small flags beside the targets fluttered in one direction, while the leaves higher above drifted differently, creating subtle patterns that few people even noticed. Ryan stepped closer, believing perhaps the older man had become overwhelmed by the pressure of the competition. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "the clock is running." Walter acknowledged him with a small nod but did not hurry. "I know." Ryan looked toward the timer, then back at the untouched quiver. "You should probably begin." Walter smiled politely without taking his eyes from the landscape ahead. "Not yet." Ryan could not understand the answer. Every second that passed reduced the available shooting time, yet Walter appeared completely unconcerned. Behind the barrier, several spectators began whispering once again. One man folded his arms and laughed softly. "Looks like he finally realized that old bow belongs at home." Another replied that perhaps the prize money had frightened him after all. Their comments drifted across the field, but Walter never reacted. He simply inhaled slowly, feeling the movement of the warm air across his face before reaching for a single cedar arrow. The motion was smooth, unhurried, and remarkably precise. He placed the arrow against the string with practiced ease, raised the ash bow in one continuous movement, and settled into a posture so balanced that it seemed almost effortless. Near the equipment shed, Harold Bennett stopped working for the second time that morning. His eyes narrowed as he watched the elderly veteran anchor the string with a technique he had not seen in decades. There was nothing exaggerated about it. Every movement was economical, disciplined, and completely free of unnecessary tension. Harold felt a strange sense of recognition growing stronger, although the memory remained frustratingly incomplete. Somewhere in his past he had watched another archer stand exactly like this, calm enough to make time itself appear slower. Ryan noticed Harold staring toward lane 12 and followed his gaze. For reasons he could not explain, the atmosphere around the elderly veteran had changed. The earlier laughter no longer sounded quite as confident. Conversations gradually faded as people became curious about why someone would wait so long before taking a single shot. Walter finally exhaled, adjusted the angle of the bow by the smallest fraction, and released the string with quiet control. The cedar arrow left the ash bough without drama, cutting smoothly through the bright July air while hundreds of eyes instinctively followed its silent flight toward the most distant target on the range. The cedar arrow traveled with quiet certainty, rising slightly before settling into a graceful arc that seemed almost too gentle for the distance it needed to cover. Hundreds of spectators watched without speaking as it crossed nearly 100 yards of open air before striking the exact center of the farthest target with a clean, unmistakable sound. For a heartbeat, the range became strangely still. Then a few people clapped politely, assuming they had just witnessed an unusually fortunate shot. Ryan Foster looked from the distant target to the old ash bough and back again. Luck, he told himself. Even experienced competitors occasionally produced remarkable shots. Walter Mercer showed no reaction at all. He calmly reached for a second cedar arrow, lifting it with the same measured movements that had already begun to puzzle everyone watching. Around him, other competitors hurried through their remaining shots, eager to finish within the time limit, adjusting sights between releases and checking electronic score displays after every arrow. Walter did neither. He stood quietly, allowing another gentle breeze to pass across the field before raising the bow once more. The second arrow left the string with exactly the same smooth rhythm as the first. It flew cleanly through the shifting wind and disappeared into another bright yellow center. This time the applause never came. Instead, conversation stopped. Several spectators leaned forward against the safety barrier, trying to understand what they had just seen. One of the younger archers who had laughed earlier lowered his expensive compound bow without realizing it. His confident smile quietly disappeared. Ryan felt an unfamiliar knot forming in his stomach. He glanced toward the electronic scoring monitor to confirm what his own eyes had already witnessed. 2 perfect scores. No adjustment. No hesitation. No visible effort. Walter reached for a third arrow. His breathing remained slow and even. His shoulders stayed relaxed. Every movement looked identical to the one before it, as though years of repetition had erased every unnecessary motion from his body. Harold Bennett continued watching from beside the equipment shed, unable to look away. The memory hiding deep inside his mind moved a little closer with every shot. He remembered another warm afternoon many years ago, another quiet man who had ignored applause, another demonstration where skill had seemed almost invisible because everything happened with such effortless control. Harold could almost hear a voice from long ago describing the importance of patience over speed, discipline over strength, and consistency over pride. The details remained frustratingly incomplete, but the feeling refused to leave him. On the firing line, Walter released his third arrow. Once again the cedar shaft drifted through the changing breeze before settling directly into the center of the target. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Nobody laughed this time. The local television cameraman slowly shifted his lens away from the leading competitors and focused entirely on the elderly veteran with the weathered ash bow. Even the event announcer paused in the middle of reading scores as volunteers confirmed another perfect hit through their spotting scopes. Ryan walked several steps closer, no longer pretending casual curiosity. He carefully studied the old bow, searching for some hidden advantage that simply was not there. There were no modern accessories, no precision optics, no advanced engineering waiting to explain what everyone had witnessed. Only polished wood shaped by skilled hands and carried by someone whose confidence never depended upon attention from others. Walter quietly lowered the bow after the third shot and waited again, not because he needed to rest, but because the wind had changed ever so slightly. The small flags near the targets fluttered in a different pattern, and he noticed immediately. Most people saw only the targets. Walter appeared to see everything between himself and them. Ryan followed the veteran's calm gaze toward the distant tree line, trying for the first time all day to understand what the old man had been studying before the competition began. Beside the equipment shed, Harold suddenly took one slow step forward as another forgotten piece of the past finally returned to him, and with it came the unsettling realization that the man standing at lane 12 had almost certainly done this before, long before anyone at Cedar Ridge believed impossible skill could arrive carrying an old bow made from ash. The competition moved into its most demanding stage as volunteers replaced the original targets with smaller circles positioned even farther across the range. A quiet announcement spread through the loudspeakers explaining that every remaining competitor would now face the final qualification sequence. Any miss would remove a contestant from contention for the grand prize. Excitement rippled through the spectators, but the mood had changed completely since the morning. Nobody was watching the latest carbon bow or the newest stabilizer anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Walter Mercer. Ryan Foster folded his clipboard beneath one arm and stood only a few yards behind lane 12. His confidence had slowly given way to genuine curiosity. He no longer searched for flaws in the old ash bow because he had begun to realize the answer was not hidden inside the equipment. It was standing quietly behind it. Walter glanced toward the distant targets, then lifted his eyes beyond them to the gently swaying treetops. The afternoon breeze had become less predictable, changing direction every few moments. Most competitors immediately reached for adjustment tools, turning small dials on their sights and discussing wind corrections with friends standing outside the shooting lanes. Walter simply closed his eyes for one slow breath before opening them again. The field became remarkably quiet around him. Harold Bennett never looked away. Then the memory finally arrived with complete clarity. More than 30 years earlier, Harold had volunteered during a military skills exhibition held at a nearby Army training facility. Among the demonstrations was an aging instructor who had amazed young soldiers by striking distant targets with a traditional wooden bow while explaining that discipline always outlasted technology. Harold remembered the instructor refusing applause afterward, saying that the bow deserved none of the credit because the real work had been completed through thousands of quiet mornings when nobody had been watching. Harold slowly looked back toward Walter, feeling the years disappear between those 2 afternoons. The posture was identical. The calm breathing was identical. Even the patient pause before every release was exactly the same. Harold whispered to himself, almost afraid to believe it. It cannot be. Walter smoothly raised the ash bough once again. The cedar arrow rested lightly against the string while the warm wind brushed across the field. He waited. Several competitors had already rushed through their own shots, hoping speed might overcome the changing conditions. Walter allowed another few seconds to pass before making the smallest adjustment with his left hand. The release came so naturally that many people barely noticed it. The arrow sailed through the uneven breeze, climbed gently above the shifting air, and settled directly into the center of the reduced target nearly 100 yards away. A wave of astonished silence rolled through the crowd before the electronic scoreboard confirmed another perfect score. Ryan stared at the display without blinking. Around him, conversation simply stopped. Harold took several slow steps toward the firing line, unable to contain the certainty growing inside him. He studied Walter's weathered face more carefully than before. Time had added gray hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but it had not erased the quiet steadiness Harold remembered. Another memory surfaced. The instructor had introduced himself only once before the demonstration began. Harold had not spoken that name in decades, yet now it returned as clearly as if no time had passed at all. He looked toward the elderly veteran with growing respect and quietly whispered, "Walter Mercer." For the first time that day, Harold understood that the remarkable accuracy unfolding before the crowd was not an unexpected surprise. It was simply the continuation of a lifetime spent mastering a skill that most people had mistaken for an ordinary hobby because they had only arrived to witness the final few minutes of a journey that had begun many decades earlier. Only one target remained, and the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The final challenge stood alone at the far end of the range, a small circular target positioned nearly 100 yards away where the afternoon wind rolled unpredictably across open grass before climbing through the surrounding oak trees. Several outstanding competitors had already fallen short during the last sequence, each missing by only a few inches, yet those few inches had ended their pursuit of the prize. Volunteers confirmed the scores while spectators remained unusually quiet, their attention fixed entirely on lane 12. Walter Mercer stood exactly where he had been since the competition began, showing no sign of excitement or pressure. His weathered ash bough rested comfortably in his left hand, and the final cedar arrow remained untouched inside the quiver. Ryan Foster no longer carried himself with the confidence of the morning. He watched the elderly veteran with genuine respect, realizing that every assumption he had made earlier had slowly disappeared one perfect shot at a time. Harold Bennett stepped closer until he stood just outside the competition boundary. The memory from decades earlier was now complete. He remembered watching a military demonstration where a quiet army veteran had spoken to a group of young soldiers before releasing a flawless series of arrows. The words returned almost exactly as Harold had first heard them. "Your hands only repeat what your character practices." Harold looked toward Walter with quiet disbelief. Time had changed the man's appearance, but it had never touched his discipline. The announcer called Walter's name for the final attempt. A gentle breeze crossed the range, causing the nearest flags to flutter while the leaves high above moved several seconds later. Walter noticed both. He slowly removed the final cedar arrow, inspected its feather fletching with familiar care, and placed it against the string. No dramatic movement followed. No theatrical pause. Only the same calm rhythm that had carried him through every shot that day. He raised the bow, settled into position, and waited. A few seconds passed. Then a few more. Some spectators instinctively glanced toward the countdown clock, wondering if he had waited too long. Walter seemed completely unaware of the timer. His attention belonged entirely to the invisible movement of the wind. Finally, he released the string. The cedar arrow climbed through the bright afternoon air with remarkable grace, drifting slightly before correcting naturally as it crossed the final stretch of open field. Hundreds of eyes followed its silent flight until it settled directly into the center of the smallest target with a clean, unmistakable sound. Nobody applauded. Nobody shouted. The entire crowd simply stood frozen as the electronic scoreboard flashed another perfect score. After several long seconds, the announcer quietly confirmed that Walter Mercer had become the only competitor to strike every target in the entire tournament. Ryan slowly walked onto the field, stopping a respectful distance away before extending his hand. "Mr. Mercer," he said with complete sincerity, "I owe you an apology. I judged your equipment before I ever considered your experience. I was wrong." Walter accepted the handshake with a warm but modest smile. "You do not owe me anything," he replied gently. "Every generation learns by looking at what is new. There is nothing wrong with that." Ryan lowered his eyes for a moment before asking the question that had filled everyone's mind. "How did you do it?" Walter looked toward the distant targets before answering in the same calm voice he had carried all day. "The important work was never done today. It was done one quiet morning at a time, long before anyone was watching." Harold quietly removed his cap and nodded with deep respect. Around them, the spectators remained silent, not because they had run out of words, but because they had finally discovered that true mastery rarely announces itself. It simply arrives, does its work with quiet dignity, and leaves every witness seeing the world a little differently. The award ceremony was supposed to begin immediately after the final scores were certified, but very few people seemed interested in the oversized ceremonial check waiting beside the stage. Instead, small groups of competitors quietly gathered around Walter Mercer as he stood beside the practice field with his old ash bow resting across one shoulder. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the laughter that had greeted him only a few hours earlier. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody demanded another demonstration. They simply waited, hoping he might share something worth remembering. Walter never acted like the center of attention. He answered every question with the same patience he had shown throughout the competition. Ryan Foster remained nearby, listening more carefully than anyone else. Earlier that morning he had believed skill could be measured by equipment specifications and technical upgrades. Now he found himself studying the weathered grip of the ash bow with genuine appreciation. "How long have you owned it?" Ryan finally asked. Walter looked down at the polished wood before smiling quietly. "I built it myself almost 30 years ago after a storm brought down an old ash tree near my home. The tree had already lived a long life. I simply gave part of it another purpose." Several young archers exchanged surprised glances. One teenager carefully examined the expensive carbon bow in his own hands as though seeing it differently for the first time. Another competitor asked whether Walter had ever considered replacing the old bow with newer equipment. Walter gently shook his head. "Tools deserve respect, but they should never become excuses. If you cannot trust your own habits, no piece of equipment will solve that problem." Harold Bennett smiled as those words echoed the lessons he remembered from decades earlier. They had not changed because the truth behind them had never changed. At the edge of the crowd, a boy of about 12 years old stood quietly holding a beginner's recurve bow that looked slightly too large for him. He had listened without speaking since the competition ended. Walter noticed him almost immediately. "Do you enjoy shooting?" he asked. The boy nodded eagerly. "I do, but I still miss a lot." Walter chuckled softly. "Everyone misses a lot in the beginning." The boy hesitated before asking, "How do I become as accurate as you?" Walter reached into his quiver and removed one of the remaining cedar arrows. He turned it slowly between his fingers before offering it to the young archer. "Do not spend your time chasing perfect shots," he said gently. "Spend your time building perfect habits. The shots will eventually follow." The boy accepted the handcrafted arrow with both hands as though it were something priceless. His father quietly thanked Walter, but the elderly veteran simply nodded and wished them both many enjoyable mornings on the range. Ryan watched the exchange with growing admiration. He realized that Walter had spoken more about patience than victory, more about discipline than talent, and more about character than trophies. The $10,000 prize had somehow become the least memorable part of the entire day. Volunteers finally approached to prepare for the official presentation, but the crowd remained gathered around the old veteran instead of moving toward the stage. Nobody was there because of the money anymore. They stayed because they had witnessed something increasingly rare, a person whose greatest accomplishment was not extraordinary accuracy, but the quiet humility that remained completely unchanged before success, during success, and after success. As the afternoon sun settled lower above the distant hills, Walter rested the ash bough against his shoulder once more, and for the first time that day Ryan understood that the finest lesson taught at Cedar Ridge had never been about archery at all. It had been about the lifelong discipline required to become the kind of person whose actions spoke long before words ever became necessary. The official presentation finally began beneath the large pavilion overlooking the range, but even as Walter Mercer accepted the championship plaque and the $10,000 prize, his expression remained exactly the same as it had been when he first stepped out of his old pickup truck that morning. He thanked the organizers with quiet sincerity, shook a few hands, and stepped away from the stage before anyone expected him to. Cameras followed him for only a moment before lowering again. The crowd had already discovered that the most meaningful moments happened when Walter was not trying to create them. Ryan Foster watched him walk toward the practice lanes instead of the sponsored booths where photographers waited for promotional pictures. Without saying a word, Ryan quietly followed. A handful of young competitors did the same. The little boy holding the cedar arrow remained close beside his father, unwilling to let the gift leave his hands. Walter stopped near the same empty practice lane where he had stood before the tournament began. The afternoon breeze had softened, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass across the open field while the small American flags along the fence moved with gentle, steady rhythm. Ryan broke the comfortable silence. I think I spent too many years teaching people how to buy better equipment instead of teaching them how to become better archers. Walter smiled kindly. Most people do not mean to make that mistake. New tools are exciting. Quiet practice is not. But quiet practice always lasts longer. Ryan nodded slowly, understanding those words more deeply than he could have that morning. Harold Bennett approached carrying a small envelope that had rested for years inside the maintenance office. He carefully removed a faded photograph and handed it to Walter. The edges had become worn with time, but the image remained clear enough to recognize a much younger Walter standing beside a group of Army instructors after the military skills demonstration Harold had remembered. Walter looked at the photograph for several long seconds before laughing softly. I have not seen this in many years. Harold smiled. I kept it because I always remembered what you told those young soldiers. I just never imagined I would hear those same lessons again. Walter gently returned the photograph. Then perhaps it belonged with you all along. Harold shook his head. Not anymore. Walter accepted it with quiet gratitude before carefully placing it inside the canvas case beside the old ash bough. Nearby, Ryan watched the exchange without interrupting. The photograph mattered less because of the uniform it showed than because it proved something Walter had never tried to prove himself. His character had remained unchanged across the decades. Before leaving, Ryan looked toward the beginner practice range where several children were taking their first lessons. Next season, he said thoughtfully, every youth clinic will begin without electronic sights. They will learn balance, breathing, patience, and respect before they ever discuss equipment. Walter nodded with approval. Foundations are invisible once. The house is finished, but they are still the most important part. The little boy looked up at Walter one final time. I am going to keep practicing with this arrow. Walter smiled warmly. Do not keep it because I gave it to you. Keep it because one day it will remind you that progress comes one careful shot at a time. As the late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the grass, the excitement of the tournament slowly gave way to quiet conversations. The prize money would eventually be spent, the scoreboards would be cleared, and another competition would come the following year. But something far more valuable had taken root at Cedar Ridge that day. Every person who had watched an old veteran carrying a simple ash bough now understood that genuine excellence was never purchased, never hurried, and never announced with pride. It was patiently earned long before anyone noticed it, and faithfully carried through life with the same quiet humility that had guided Walter Mercer from his first arrow to his last. As the last visitors slowly left Cedar Ridge, the evening settled gently across the range, carrying with it the quiet satisfaction that only follows a day people know they will remember for the rest of their lives. Volunteers folded tables, packed away banners, and collected target stands while the golden light of the setting sun stretched across the open field where hundreds of arrows had flown only hours before. Walter Mercer stood beside his old blue pickup truck with the familiar canvas case resting in the bed exactly where it had begun the morning. Nothing about the truck looked extraordinary. Nothing about the bow suggested championship trophies or prize money. Yet everyone who passed by looked at both with new respect. Ryan Foster walked over carrying a small wooden plaque that had been engraved only moments earlier in the clubhouse workshop. He held it carefully before handing it to Walter. "This belongs to you," he said. Walter examined the polished oak surface before quietly shaking his head. "It belongs here." Ryan looked confused. Walter smiled gently and handed the plaque back. "Hang it where every young archer can see it. They will need the lesson more than I will." Ryan looked down at the inscription carved into the wood. It simply read, "Master the archer before you admire the bow." There was no mention of prize money. No mention of records. No mention of perfect scores. Ryan nodded slowly. "It will stay here." Harold Bennett approached one final time and offered Walter a firm handshake. Neither man spoke for several moments. They did not need to. Some conversations had already been completed decades earlier and merely continued when old friends crossed paths again. Harold finally smiled. "You taught another generation today." Walter looked across the empty range where the little boy had spent several minutes carefully practicing after the ceremony ended. "No," he answered softly. "They taught themselves. They only needed a reason to slow down long enough to see what mattered." The boy and his father waved from the parking lot before climbing into their vehicle. The cedar arrow remained safely tucked inside a protective case, already becoming something far more valuable than a souvenir. Ryan watched them drive away before turning back toward Walter. "Will you come back next year?" Walter looked toward the distant hills where the last sunlight rested along the tree line. "If I am able." Ryan smiled. "I hope you do. There are many people who still have questions." Walter closed the canvas case and secured the worn leather straps with steady hands. "Questions are easy," he replied. "The answers arrive one practice session at a time." With that, he climbed into the old pickup truck, started the engine, and slowly drove down the gravel road until the taillights disappeared beyond the curve lined with oak trees. No music followed him. No cheering crowd gathered behind him. Only the gentle sound of tires rolling across gravel faded into the evening air. In the weeks that followed, Ryan kept his promise. The wooden plaque was mounted beside the entrance to the range where every visitor would see it before touching a bow. The youth training program was redesigned to emphasize patience, discipline, breathing, and consistency before modern equipment was ever discussed. Harold placed the faded photograph inside a display case beneath the plaque, not as a monument to one remarkable day, but as a reminder that true character remains recognizable across an entire lifetime. Years later, newcomers would often ask about the old man with the wooden bow whose photograph greeted everyone entering Cedar Ridge. Ryan always smiled before giving the same simple answer. He did not come here to prove he was better than anyone else. He came here to remind us that the strongest foundations are built when nobody is watching. And on quiet summer mornings, when the flags moved gently above the practice lanes and the wind whispered through the ash trees beyond the field, more than one young archer would pause before taking the first shot, remembering that real mastery never demanded attention. It earned respect through patience, humility, and the quiet discipline to do ordinary things extraordinarily well. Some victories are measured by trophies, but the ones people remember for a lifetime are measured by the lives they quietly change.